Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Innal hamdalillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayhi. Wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We have a very interesting, I find it extremely interesting, very interesting session today. And I hope that there's going to be a little bit of give and take. I'll give you a few of my reflections, a few of my thoughts, ideas from some of the reading I've been doing recently and also in the past. And I really hope that we're going to be able to learn from you as well today, inshallah. Okay, have a lot to go through in a very short time, so we better get cracking. So today is going to be a session on the subject of leading with intelligences. And you might say, oh, humble me, I am no leader. Okay, hopefully you will see that each one of you are leaders, just by virtue of the fact that if you are concerned, you are a leader. Khalas, it's really as simple as that. Okay, so the question now is, okay, lead, how do we lead? And we're going to talk about this idea of intelligences, multiple intelligences. And I've been a bit bold as to say this is the mark of a mu'min. Right, so today we're going to start by talking about transcendence, iman, and connecting that with action. Then we're going to talk a little bit about aspirations and how should a believer, through this desire and through the power of their iman, be kind of propelled to find a way of making the most maximum impact through their short lives. Okay, and then we will answer that with the idea of multiple intelligences, inshallah. Right, so starting with the mind, we're talking about intelligence. Well, intelligence is, I suppose, in the mind, is it not? So it would be probably quite reasonable to talk about the mind itself. I've been doing a lot of absolutely amazing reading in the past few months, maybe a year, a bit less, on the mind. And that's a whole nother discussion in many ways, actually. However, it's just been enlightening. What it's allowed me to do through this kind of journey of looking at how the mind works and what are the components of the mind. This is not the brain. There's a bit of a distinction there. It's a bit like the operating system of the brain. The mind is the operating system of the brain. You know, we know how to use Windows. We haven't got a foggiest how all the wiring works, so that's too complicated. You know, the CPU, where the memory comes in and the cache and all that stuff, graphics card, all that business. We'll leave that to the neuroscientists, okay? But we all need to have an understanding of how our mind works. In essence, the mind could be thought to be split into three components. These are three components that are very useful to sort of kind of, you know, to use as a model. It's not necessarily exactly how things really are, but you have the unconscious mind where a lot of stuff goes on. Okay, then you have the conscious mind. This is the bit which, you know, you could say is like the nafs. This is the bit that is like the prefrontal cortex, where you're conscious of what you're thinking. Okay, and then your thoughts, sometimes you allow your thoughts to go off in different directions, but you can direct your thoughts towards what are actually your needs. So what we might call the aspirational self or the aspirational mind. Okay, and these are needs which, you know, I could say as a Muslim are our needs because the Quran says we need them, we should do them, and this is actually what Islam teaches. But what's absolutely amazing is that lots and lots of psychological research confirms this as well. And so we have, you know, you might have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this sort of triangle, and at the top of it comes up here is self-acceptance. Not self-acceptance, self-actualization, finding your own personal purpose in life and realizing it. Okay, that's the kind of ultimate achievement for a human being, you might say. Okay, and then, you know, lower than that, you have basic needs, which all kind of animals have, and human beings, being animals in a way, have as well. And then there's growth needs like learning, aesthetics, etc. Then you actually have a need to to manifest good character, a need to be kind and caring, and to give and actually be part of a community that's caring. That's a need that we have, and it's one that in many ways in the 20th century, 21st century, we've forgotten about, and hence a lot of the mental illness and troubles that we have actually. Okay, and then beyond that, we have this thing that Maslow talked about, and you may have heard of Maslow. He was a kind of very well-known psychologist, president of the American Psychological Association or Society for many years, and you know, he kind of came to the conclusion that, you know, the ultimate aim for people is self-actualization, realizing what they're good at and achieving that. Okay, now the interesting thing is that there is more beyond that. That beyond that is, and these are needs, is a need for self-acceptance. This is this idea that you get to a point where you actually come to accept that your time on this earth is finite. Okay, without that, there's this constant existential unease about the shortness of your life and the desire to cling on to life at, you know, at all costs, essentially. Okay, but beyond that is this feeling of transcendence. This is where your desire to hold on to the self and see the self as all important starts to dissolve as you start to connect to something much greater. And the greater thing that you can connect to can be something like the brotherhood of humanity, human causes. After all, people used to give their life for communism, did they not? For the greatness, the glory of the state, and, you know, their fellow man. But beyond that is also this sense of connecting to the universe, the cosmos, and beyond that, connecting to the higher intelligence, and Allah, essentially. So my kind of last reading in psychology was this amazing book called Transcend, which deals with that whole area of transcendence and all the research that has gone into that. And interestingly, even though Maslow talked about the self-actualizing person, he, towards the last part of his life, when he actually knew he was dying, he had lots of ischemic heart disease, heart trouble, heart attacks, etc. And in those days, they couldn't do a fat lot for it. This is like just kind of like coming towards the 1970s, early 1970, I think. So he knew he was dying, and then he started to think really hard about, okay, there are different types of self-actualizers. So a sportsman is a self-actualizer. They have phenomenal bodily potential, which I certainly don't have, and or maybe I did, but anyway, another story. So and they reach it, okay. But there's different types of self-actualizers. He realized there are people who go beyond that, who start to look at the bigger picture and feel a cause. They feel a greater purpose than just the achievement of their own self. Okay, so this is this idea of a transcender, a person who goes beyond their own ego and the fulfillment of their own personal desires, you might say. Okay, so he talks about the transcender as a person who is struggling and reaching upward, and really have a better prognosis. You know, they do better in terms of fulfillment, you could say, than the ones who rest perfectly content at the self-actualization level. Because the self-actualization is great. You've done what your body could do, but then what's next? Do you see what I mean? So he talks about how peak experiences, we'll talk about this, and plateau experiences become the most important things in the lives of these people. He's describing transcenders, the high spots. So they're driven by this desire for this type of feeling of something much bigger, right? And they also have amazing qualities that he describes, and we can relate to these, right? They perceive the sacred within the secular, i.e. the sacredness in all things. And also they can switch back to the worldly. So they go back to the worldly, they see the bigger thing, the bigger purpose behind it all. And whenever they want to, they can sacralize, as in see the sacred, right? And these people are much more consciously, deliberately motivated by values such as perfection, truth, beauty, goodness, and unity. He talks about these transcenders. These are people who transcend the ego more often and more easily. Well, we've talked about that, yeah? And they're more apt to be innovators, discoverers of the new, of what actually could be, what exists in potential, and therefore what might be brought to pass. They're less content with the world. Yeah, so that even though there's a kind of fulfillment in these people and a kind of happiness, but there's also an unease, there's an internal tension, because their direct seeing of the beauty of the world and of the saintly possibilities in human nature, of the non-necessity of so much human evil, and of seemingly obvious necessities for a good world. Yeah, they can see that something different can be done. The world can be different, and they want to realize that. They find that increasing knowledge is associated with an increased sense of mystery, of awe, humility, etc. So it's that idea that actually there is so much to learn and it's a journey, it's not an end. And these people are more apt to be profoundly religious or spiritual. So he's been looking, he was studying all sorts of different people, you know, Gandhi, lots of different philosophers and psychologists, etc. And people that he really was inspired by. And was looking at, well, what is the qualities in these people? But he noticed that they tend to be the more spiritual and the religious type. And these are people who speak easily, naturally, and unconsciously the language of being, the language of poets, of mystics, seers, etc. So you think, oh, you know, I think he's coining it nicely. Now, what's the peak experience? So a peak experience is basically a kind of almost like an out-of-body experience. It's where you get like a kind of massive buzz explosion of transcendence. It's where you suddenly, like, you know, you can leave the world behind and go into something else. Now, as Muslims, obviously, we see that happening with ibadah. Sometimes you can read the Quran and you just feel that transcendence, do you not? You know, Surah Rahman, for instance. But at the same time, also, there are other ways. There are other religions. Meditation can cause a peak experience, but also drugs as well, like LSD and some other mind-altering drugs can do it as well. So it then begs the question, well, what's healthy transcendence? Is it healthy to just go from one buzz to another and spend your whole life just like, oh yeah, man, you know, or is there actually a purpose to transcendence that's positive in the way that, you know, the kind of Maslow was toying with right at the end? And so Scott Barry Kaufman, who wrote this book, Transcend, came to the conclusion that there has to be a healthy transcendence, that transcenders are able to see something bigger. They can envision a better world. So their transcendence has to impact the world. Yeah. How can we integrate transcendent experiences into the ongoing stream of everyday life? For him, healthy transcendence, therefore, is the harmonious integration of one's whole self in the service of cultivating the good society. So, you know, this whole self that we see down here, this is the aspirational self. This is all the things you can want to be, but this has all got to lead towards impacting. Yeah. Okay. So you think, well, this is all very nice, psychologists, great. Okay. But what does Islam have to say with all of this? And it might be worth starting with this wonderful kind of anecdote, you might say. So there's a very, very well-known mystic from Indian mystical Sufi from the 15th, 16th century who wrote these verses. He said, Muhammad of Arabia ascended the highest heaven and returned. I swear by God, if I had reached that point, I should never have returned. I mean, obviously he had to anyway, but he wouldn't have had that choice. That wasn't for him. But why would he desire that? Now, so what I'd be interested in, let's just see if I can, how do I, oh, I'm trying to look for, oh, here we go, chat, yeah. So what would you say was the reason that the Prophet returned? So he went to, this is talking about Isra and Mi'raj, going up. He went up, right? Why did he come back down? Why, you know, I mean, obviously the Prophet was sent back down, but he actually would have wanted to come back down. Why do you think? And by all means, just chuck something in the chat about that. Any thoughts? Yeah. So Tom, absolutely, a sense of concern for humanity. Rasul Sallallahu was not like that. You know, transcendence is a great buzz. It's a wonderful feeling, but that's not rahmatul lil alamin, the mercy of the worlds. That was not his concern. You know, the Prophet Sallallahu, the beautiful hadith, which talks about how on the day of judgment, the prophets will be reclining on gold encrusted thrones, and he said, but my throne will be empty, and I'll be dashing around saying, my ummah, and trying to save people from the hellfire. Subhanallah, that's the nature of the Prophet. Okay, so Muhammad Iqbal actually wrote about this. He responded in his book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought. He's a famous Indian poet philosopher who inspired the creation of Pakistan. And he was kind of scathing of that verse, essentially. He says that the mystic does not wish to return from the repose of unitary experience. And even when he does return, as he must, his return does not mean much for mankind at large. The prophet's return is creative. He returns to insert himself into the sweep of time with a view to control the forces of history and thereby to create a fresh world of ideals. Yeah, so for the prophet, that transcendent experience, that peak experience, triggers an awakening within him of world-shaking psychological forces calculated to completely transform the human world. Wow. Okay, so you think, okay, well, he's another philosopher. What about the Quran? What does the Quran say about this? So there are a number of places in the Quran where Islam is summarized in a nutshell, and they're beautiful and they are worthy of study. If you want to prioritize studying anything, study these verses. They are just so superb. In fact, they kind of come together, and there's a very similar theme through all of them, which, you know, I've sort of coined as the spiritual code, you might say. Okay, but I want to have a look at this section firstly, which is Surah Mu'minun. And this is a section of verses specifically about believers, since we're talking about Iman, right? Transcenders, you might say, Muslim transcenders. So it starts with قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, that the believers, and this is all past tense, and qad sort of emphasize something that's done and dusted, it's happened, right? قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, the believers of a surety have won through. I mean, I know the tense, you know, the tense is kind of played with poetically in the Quran, and people translate it in the way that it would kind of normally work in English, maybe. But you know, so this translation, I'll say something about this translation. But look at the qualities. Those who humble themselves in their prayers, avoid vain talk, pay the zakat, guard their chastity, faithfully observe their trusts and covenants, strict their prayers, strictly guard their prayers. And أولئك هم الوارثون الذين يرثون الفردوس هم فيها خالدون. They will be the inheritors, and they will inherit Al-Firdaus, the highest paradise, and they will dwell therein forever. Wow. So the idea is that you have to have a number of qualities to be this kind of believer, ultimate Muslim. Yeah, not just an average kind of Muslim. So the first thing that's mentioned here as the qualities is that they have khushu' in their prayers. And khushu' is actually transcend. It's like having a peak experience in your prayer. Like the Prophet said that the coolness of my eyes is the prayer. And he said that the closest a person is to Allah is in sajda. And you can feel that. You can feel that buzz when you go into sajda. And, you know, you literally cannot see the rest of the world. And you're able to then imagine the greatness. You imagine the distance. You say, glory to my Lord, the highest. And you think about how high he is and just how massive his dominion is. And you get this sense of transcendence in sajda. Should you choose to, should any of us, should I choose to, it's there. You know, you can walk, you sit back up feeling like, you know, So this is the interesting thing, that they have khushu' in their prayer, and then they carry on doing the other things. Now, the next thing is, it says here, those who pay the zakat. It's not actually what it says. The Arabic says, liz zakati fa'ilun. So fa'ila is to do. They do zakah. That's interesting. So that's why I do like Yusuf Ali sometimes. And he translates this as who are active in deeds of charity. Because it's about action, about doing zakah. And zakah in those days, this is a Meccan surah, was not about the kind of, the tax or 2% tax. This was about charity, just giving and being active in charity. So you can see that straight away, this is talking about healthy transcendence. You have this experience that charges you up, and then you go out and you do the good. You go out and you do the good. Okay. We have lots of other verses that talk about the same idea. You've got, for instance, this verse in Surah Hajj, which says, O believers, bow down, prostrate yourselves and worship your Lord, and do good, that you may be successful. This is almost like a summary of the previous section, essentially. Talking about success, falah, tuflihun, and it's the same in Surah Mu'minun as well, qad aflaha al-mu'minun, same success, and the idea is you worship and then you do good, practically, physically good, okay? This verse about the akhirah, about the joy that the believers will have, ya kulu washrabu hani'an bima kuntum ta'malun, that enjoy with kind of satisfaction because of what you did, right? Not just the being, but what you did. And we look at other verses that are connected to this kind of summary of Islam. And you look at Surah Balad, and it talks about freeing the bondsman, freeing the enslaved. And there are still lots of enslaved people in the world today. And freeing them is a massive task. Are we up to it? Are we interested? Giving food in the day of privation, etc. If we look at another one, the wisdom of Luqman. So Luqman alayhi salam tells his son, and it's beautiful verses of Surah Luqman, where he's advising his son about lots and lots of things. Again, very similar themes, saying the same sort of things. And he says, Ya bunayya, my dear son, aqim as-salata wa'mur bil ma'rufi wanha 'anil munkar, and enjoin al-ma'ruf, good, and try to prevent munkar, bad, you might say. Yeah, wasbir ala ma asabak. Inna dhalika min azm al-umur. So this is a very important point as well. Let's just move on to it. This idea of creating positive change, which is actually what Luqman alayhi salam was telling his son. He was saying to instruct ma'ruf. And we have this other verse here, again about the same thing, where Allah says that you are the best of peoples, evolved for mankind, ukhrijat linnas, because ta'muruna bil ma'ruf, you enjoin the good and the common good and prevent wrongs whilst believing in God. Wa tu'minuna billah. Actually, so as a nation, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what we're here for. That's our raison d'etre, is creating positive change. And it's a great American scholar, Sherman Jackson, has an amazing article on this subject, where he explains that al-ma'ruf, that the Prophet ﷺ was interested in Arabia's common good. What's good for all of Arabia? That is ma'ruf. That which is known. Ma'ruf means it's from arifa, to know well, to be familiar with. So it's what everyone is familiar with as being good and positive. It's not our own tribal good. So some people seem to think that, commanding the good means to command clothing, food, all our tribal identity as a Muslim. It's not about that. It's about the common good, okay? That which is known by convention to be good, wholesome, and sound. And then remember this, where are we? This ayah of the Prophet. So munkar is the opposite. It's what's rejected. Munkar means rejected, what society rejects as being unhelpful, right? So the Prophet ﷺ in this famous hadith said, none of you, no, he says that whoever sees a munkar, something harmful in society, then change it with his hand, like go out there and try and make a difference, at least speak out. And the very least thing is just to hate it in your heart. But that's weak faith in the sense that the faith is not being manifested. Your faith is being manifested very weakly. Yeah, so the mu'min is the one who tries to get out there and make a difference. You see? Okay. So believers are aspirational. You get that? This is our aspiration as a community, and it should be our aspiration as individuals, right? We're restless. We're not settled with the world as it is. Doesn't sit right with us. Yeah, and we've seen the verses in the Quran that we're about fixing the world, righting the wrongs, freeing the enslaved, and so on and so forth. And there are many verses in the Quran that talk about having that aspiration. Yeah, وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ. And for this, let those aspire who have aspirations. So the Quran is reaching out to people with aspirations. Aspire, do something exceptional. And Surah Rahman, yeah, and هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. Can the reward for excellence be anything but excellent? And in Surah Rahman, the description of two levels of paradise. And then this thing connects to the highest level. And as-sabiqun, fas-sabiqun as-sabiqun, that in surah, the next surah talks about how there'll be two levels of good people, and the foremost will be foremost. They'll be foremost in the judgment, they'll be foremost in the hereafter. Yeah. Now, sorry, just 1 second. Okay. So so Sherman Jackson ends by pointing out that ma'ruf is an open-ended term, and it means different things in different contexts. It means doing what you must. So he says that Muslims should rely on the forms of reasoning, knowledge, and deliberation that are not dictated by religious law. You won't get religious law telling you how to implement ma'ruf, right? You have to go out there and find. And he talks about, I've skipped through it, but he talks about how actually the way you do that is just the way anyone else would. Believers are not any different to anybody else in just having to explore the world and finding the best ways to manifest, to implement, to realize ma'ruf, realize this positive change in society. Okay, so you could ask, well, what did the Prophet ﷺ do in order to manifest ma'ruf? And we see that actually there was a huge amount of knowledge, local knowledge, that the Prophet and their companions had of their world, of their society, that helped them to implement the changes and to kind of like defend Islam and to allow it to flourish in the peninsula of Arabia. So if you think that companions spent all their time in the mosque, they didn't. To become good warriors, imagine how much time they had to spend practicing archery, how much time they had to spend practicing swordsmanship, yeah, getting good at horse riding, etc. Seeking expertise. So the Battle of the Ditch, you know about that, and the suggestion from Salman al-Farsi that, well, in Persia we do this thing which makes it very difficult for people to attack a city. We build a ditch around the city. Their knowledge of languages and dialects so that they could influence, impact, inspire people the best way. In fact, the Quran was allowed to be read in different dialects at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's actually at the time of Uthman that the other versions were destroyed, so that just the Qurayshi dialect could be kept. And they knew the qualities of each of the tribes. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he was approaching different tribes during Hajj in Mecca, towards the end, the last couple of years in Mecca, he would ask Abu Bakr, who was an expert on the histories of the tribes, to tell him about these tribes, tell them who the great people were in the tribe, what they'd done, and he would talk to the tribes and start by extolling the virtues of the tribe and the virtues of the great people in the tribe, just to kind of create that connection. That's cultural intelligence, right? Yeah. Practical things. How do you survive in a desert? Trades, trade is a skill. It's a skill, and they needed it. So you can see that the companions weren't, they were skilled in their context, in their world. Now, I'm just going to spend just 2 minutes on a world that was very much changing, but where for a few years, Muslims often didn't adapt to the world. So you may have watched the film Umar al-Mukhtar, and you may know about the Sanussi movement. So I'm just using an example. There are lots of examples of kind of Islamic movements and communities that tried to resist Westernization in the 19th century. Now, bear in mind, you've got to be fair to them. Westernization in those days was basically colonization. It was, imperialism. It was the taking over of your country and the kind of, the appropriation of your resources. That's actually what it was. So no wonder they reacted quite violently to it sometimes. So the Sanussi movement, for instance, tried to fight against the Italians. And this is an interview with the last Sanussi, or you might say the king of Libya in 1890. And the interviewer asks him, so why are you opposed to modern culture? And he says, the Sanussi only aim at piety and nobility of heart. And how shall this be achieved? By excluding everything but God from our thoughts, by moderation and by abstaining from all enjoyments which do not bring us nearer to God. So the Sanussi movement, you have to look them up. It was brilliant, amazing place, a region in Libya where there were sort of a Sufi movement and used to have mosques that were very sort of like centers of the community. And the people there were warriors, and at the same time they were very pious, and it's just amazing. It just sounded amazing, the descriptions of this place called Jabub, etc. Anyway, so he carries on. The question goes, why then do the Italians take action against the Sanussi? And he says, because the man who follows our teachings becomes healthy in body and mind. The Italian fascists are interested in making the entire population degenerate, as in so many other places in the world of Islam. If that happens, Italian civilization can advance more rapidly. So long as our teachings rules, it will not happen. It overestimates outward technical progress. It makes external splendor and power the ruling factor in the judgment of a person or nation, and it despises inner development. I mean, all of this is true. The common feature, though, is the rejection of all things Western. So this is a description of the zawiyas that the Sanussis had. And the outcome of the resistance of the Sanussis, though valorous as it was, and tragic as the outcome was, is that the Italian fascists, as they were described, basically just ran over them. And here's a description by Muhammad Asad in his book Road to Mecca, where he catches up, this is a few years later, a few decades later, catches up with one of the straggling remnants of the Sanussis. The guy describes, he says, we defended house after house, but they were too strong for us. Our rifles were useless against their armored cars. So in the end, they overwhelmed us. Only a few of us escaped. And on the next day, he commanded that some of our elders and ulama be taken up in an aeroplane, and they were hurled out of the plane high above the ground to their deaths. And all through the second night, I heard from my hiding place the cries of our helpless women and the laughter of the soldiers and their rifle shots. It's a tragic end. But it just shows that there was a world at one time where, where the West was seen as all things evil, all things to be rejected. We are in a totally different world today. I just wanted to provide that as a kind of contrast to the world that we're in. Look, we, all of you here, are actually Western, right? you may not think of it that way, but you are. You actually are. What language am I speaking? What culture? What clothes am I wearing? You know, where are you from? We're citizens with equal, theoretically, potential rights. Okay, we don't see really the dichotomy that was seen back then between Eastern and Western, Islamic and modern. Right? Our culture, our country is our country. It's Britain. Yeah, and it has different challenges, but these are the challenges that as mu'mins we embrace and we take on for the entire country. As the Quran says, "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas." You are the best of people, evolved for mankind. There are also, speaking of mankind, global challenges that everybody is facing, that you are all going to be facing, and you're going to need to embrace all manner of knowledge and skills in order to thrive and to be impactful in this new world. Yeah. So what are we talking about in terms of this? And essentially the kind of key mentors of campus, Sarah, Mubashir, myself, spent a few months scoping out all the kind of things that we think people need to learn in order to thrive and be impactful in society, but also, number one, be secure in their faith, secure as individuals, and then be impactful. Okay, and this is a whole bunch of intelligence which all kind of emanate from the central intelligence, which is spiritual intelligence. So spiritual intelligence is essentially saying, and the Prophet ﷺ was the first person to talk about spiritual intelligence. Someone asked him, who is the intelligent person? And he said, it's the person, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, who remembers death and prepares for it. That's the intelligent person. So spiritual intelligence is not about carrying lots of books, memorizing lots of Quran or Hadith or anything like that. It's about having a secure iman, to have that deep, deep conviction in the religion, to appreciate the beauty of what Islam is about. You know, to be confident in and easy with the objections and able to reconcile them. You know, to be sure about your faith, but also to have that love for Allah, love for God, that dear connection with Him, that friendship with Him. That's spiritual intelligence. It's seeing the reality of the hereafter, seeing the reality of the temporariness of this world, having a love for the Prophet, a love for the Quran. All of these things you could say are spiritual intelligence. But also there's a moral intelligence that we have to have. Yeah, we know that a believer, we've seen it, and there's so many more verses that makes absolutely clear, is that you're driven to do good consistently. And the question then is, well, okay, well, how do you define good? What is good? And, you know, are all Islamic laws just? Is that what they're here for? How do we establish the validity of the laws of Islam? And how do we apply them to different contexts? Are there universal ethics? Does Islam value those? Do ethics evolve depending on the context? And then if that's the case, and in our life today, what is an ethical life? And is law always ethical, or is it catching up? Does it play catch up, meaning that it doesn't always correlate? As an example, all the laws on imperial expansion, in Islamic law on imperial expansion, the laws on slavery, the validity of slavery, all of that was there at one time, but you might say that that doesn't necessarily, you know, many patriarchal rulings, etc. So that's moral intelligence, which I think, you know, we've got to grapple with because it's a day-to-day challenge. Then you've got personal psychological intelligence, which is this idea that, look, you know, you can't flourish in your faith until you're secure in yourself. You've got to look after yourself psychologically, holistically, bodily, you know, in sort of so many different ways to become kind of comfortable, relatively resilient. And how do you, you know, motivate yourself to be growth orientated, you know, understanding knowledge, understanding how to not be misled by different types of knowledge. All of that comes into this personal intelligence. And then you've got emotional intelligence. Obviously, everyone's very familiar with this idea, but remember, the mu'min is a master of adab. A believer is a master of culture, civility, of good relations. Yeah, we're in the business of relationships. So how do you thrive with that? What are the dangers? How do you look out for those? Organizational intelligence. If you have a duty to make a difference in the world, you have a duty to be impactful. There's no point. The weakest of iman is just to feel it in the heart or just talk about it. Talking about it, jumping and shouting is not necessarily impactful, right? Yeah, that's medium level iman. It's not the highest level of iman. So to be a change maker, you have to realize that to be impactful requires organization. It always does, you know. And so how do you do that effectively? Cultural intelligence is this idea that, look, our faith is not Eastern or Western, yeah, but culture is important to human societies, to communities. It gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of connection amongst themselves. It sets the parameters through which they engage with each other, right? So us as Muslims have multiple identities. Islam itself creates a certain identity, but being British, we have identities. So how do we deepen our identities? Because your identity allows you to connect to other people. So this is what that cultural intelligence is about, right? As we saw with the Prophet ﷺ. Then you have societal intelligence. Society is broken. It has many challenges, you know, and we're driven to make a difference in our country. So what are the problems? Can we map out the suffering in society? Can we map out the challenges? Can we map out the institutions that are there to improve things, to make a difference? Where does power lie? What's the map of power? And how do we effect change in society? And then global, there are lots and lots of global challenges. And you are all global citizens. We know that it's easier and easier to connect globally now. You could be working for a Chinese company and you might be negotiating with American clients, but living in sub-Saharan Africa. That could be you 10 years from now, quite easily. Yeah. So how does the world work? Where's the power in the world? What are the different cultures in the world? How do we relate to them? How do we connect them? Are there any histories that connect all the different cultures across the world? Well, that's all a phenomenal area of learning too. I'm going to end now. I've talked for too long.